So I've got two cutting boards here, one of wood, one made of plastic from my kitchen. And which one's safer to use from a microbiological standpoint? Which one should you use to prevent contamination of food? Yeah, we'll have a closer look. The answer is not quite as straightforward and as easy as it might look. Yeah, it depends. That's the answer. So hi, hello, and welcome again. Microbehunter here. I'm Oliver. Today I would like to continue the series of kitchen safety and kitchen microbiology, and I would like to have a closer look at those cutting boards here, because it's been said that you should not be using wooden cutting boards because they are dangerous, because they can help cross-contaminate. So in other words, when you cut a raw chicken on a wooden cutting board, and then essentially when you clean it off, then because of the tiny pores in the wood, the bacteria, the salmonella and the other bacteria from the chicken have entered the wood, and this is how it can spread also to other foods or to other foods, and therefore you should not be using wooden cutting boards. This is basically what has been said, and indeed there are recommendations that many countries are saying that, or even laws and guidelines, that you are not allowed to use anything made of wood inside a commercial kitchen. So, but how does, is it really a problem or not, and how does this look like? Well, of course, scientists did experiments, and what they have done is they have deliberately contaminated plastic and also wooden cutting boards with bacteria, and then they measured how many bacteria they were able to retrieve again, get back. And it was actually, the answer was quite surprising. What they found out is that there are actually many more bacteria that can be spread over plastic cutting boards than over wooden cutting boards. This is kind of strange, is it not? I mean, I thought it's a paradox. It should be exactly the other way around. Well, essentially, the issue is indeed more complicated. And what they have found out is that while it is indeed correct that wooden cutting boards have actually tiny holes and pores in which bacteria can go, actually they get stuck there. So this means they're not able to leave the cutting board anymore, and therefore essentially it retains the bacteria. And they've also found out that well, actually it does not really depend so much on the material itself. It depends more on how scratched the surface is. So a surface that's fairly smooth actually is less of a problem than a surface that is scratched, and it doesn't matter which material it's made from. You see, there are apparently other factors that play a role here. Now, for all practical purposes, I do have three recommendations that you should adhere to regardless of which material of a cutting board you're using. And the first recommendation is that's so obvious. Of course, you have to clean the cutting board, obviously, right? Because it is indeed the case, even if a scratch is very small, these are huge mountains and valleys for bacteria. And if you just rinse it, then basically the chances are pretty good that you're not able to remove all of the contaminants because they're able to hide in the tiny cracks which you're barely able to see with your unaided eye. So proper washing, proper scrubbing, best with hot water, is of course always a good idea, especially if you used some fatty or greasy meat, for example. Then of course this grease alone cannot be removed easily with water, so you have to use some detergent, some dishwashing detergent. So that's of course recommendation number one. I mean, that's kind of obvious, right? Recommendation number two is after you've washed it, definitely make sure that they dry and that they stay dry and that they dry quickly. Of course, in this case, plastic cutting boards have an advantage because they're less absorbent than, for example, the wood, and therefore wood does take a longer time to dry. But once dry, bacteria cannot multiply, and and many bacteria die also in this process, in the drying process. So this is the second recommendation, and yeah, as a matter of fact, I think drying is one of the maybe most overlooked but extremely essential part of keeping anything clean. And then the third advice that I can give you, and yes, it's still something that we should adhere to, is use separate cutting boards for raw meat and for vegetables which you eat raw. So basically for all of the food that you have to cook, make sure that you use a separate cutting board, especially meats. Because what happens is if you're cutting raw meat on a wooden cutting board, what will happen indeed is that some of the meat juices will soak into the cutting board. I'm not so much worried about the bacteria now. That is also an issue, okay? But I'm more talking about the nutrients that are now in the wooden cutting board. So all of the meat proteins and lipids and so on, they actually are an important food source also for bacteria. So that means once it's covered with all of those nutrients, and when you do not dry it, then of course bacteria can multiply much more quickly, right? So what's the take-home message here? I think the take-home message is the following: if you've got a wooden cutting board, just keep on using it. That's not the main issue. Replace it when it's scratched too much, but do the same thing also if you're using a plastic cutting board. And the basic kitchen hygiene, as you can see, does not depend primarily on the material of the cutting board, but basically on how you essentially clean and how you store the equipment that you're using. All from my side today. Hope it was informative. Leave your comments below. Happy microbe hunting as always. See you in the next video. Bye bye.